Hello, everyone. As we get closer to Purim, one of the options of how to do a Seudah on Friday is to do what's called Pores Mapa Umekadesh, to ultimately start the meal on Friday and to end it on Shabbos. And we already talked about the protocol and how to do it. However, it's no secret that it's not always possible to have a Ma'ariv minyan after that Seudah, namely a late Ma'ariv on a Friday night. There are many synagogues around the world that have one minyan Friday night, and it's going to be, quote unquote, on time, namely closer to the beginning of Shabbos. And the question is, can you still go ahead and do this Pores Mapal Mekadesh and leave in the middle of your meal to go to a minyan, ultimately come back and continue your meal? Is that possible? Or is that usser? And that's what I wanted to speak about today. So if you look at the source sheet right in front of you, you could see that this is indeed a machlokes in the Gemara. So ultimately, the Gemara if you look at the source sheet in front of you, you could see that this is ultimately a machlokes in the Gemara. If you look at the source sheet in front of you, you could see that Masechet Pesachim Daf Kuf Aleph Amud Bet brings two opinions, Rav Chisda and Rav Sheshet. Says Rav Chisda that ultimately, when you start eating in one place and go to another, it's a problem, except for things that ultimately would obligate you to go back to the original place and bench. And what are those things? Those things are, of course, a meal with bread. Since the majority of the world is going to eat a Seudat Purim with bread, says Rav Chisda, and I quote his words, Aval dvarim hateunim bracha bimkomam ein tzarich levarech. If you're eating bread or a bread-based meal, you don't have to worry about making a bracha again. You can leave your Purim Seudah. You can go to shul to daven Kabbalah, Shabbos, and Ma'ariv. You can come back, and you do not make hamotzi again or berei pri hagefen again. Ultimately, why? My taima, says Rav Chisda, likvia kama hadar. Explains Rashi those words, klomar, al dat sudah rishona ochel hashav v'sayem seudata. Namely, when he goes to shul, he has in mind he's coming back to this seudah. He didn't finish his meal, and therefore there's no problem. You don't have to come home, make a motzi again, wash again, etc. Says the Rosh, a little different than Rashi, but the same idea. Klomar, she'im lo haya ochel kan, if he didn't eat here, haya tzarich lachzor likamo levarech. If you started eating in your house and you went to shul and then you went to a Shabbos meal somewhere else, according to the halacha, since it was a bread-based meal, you would have to go back to your home and bench there. And because of that, have ki'ilu hu adayin bimkomo. So even if you go to shul and you talk to people, it's like you're still in the middle of the meal. Namely, you still have in your mind, I have to go back home to bench. And therefore, it's like your meal didn't end. And therefore, you come home and you continue the meal, and the Ma'ariv is no problem. That's the opinion of Rav Chisda. But Rav Sheshet disagrees. Rav Sheshet says, ultimately, there's no way to leave your meal in the middle, and you will have to bench, and then leave, and then come back, wash, make a motzi, do everything anew. How do we paskin in the Rishonim? So on this particular issue, it comes down to party lines, namely the Sephardic postim basically are lechumra, like Rav Sheshet, and the Ashkenazic poskim are like Rav Chisda lekula. The Rambam basically paskins, as you could see here, that ultimately if you leave your meal and go to another house, if it's a bread-based meal like the Purim Seudah, says the Rambam, tzarich levarech lemafreya al ma she'achal. You have to first bench when you come back from shul. Vechozer mevarech b'tchila hamotzi, and then for your Shabbos meal you have to wash and say hamotzi. V'achar kach yigmor seudato. Namely, the minute you left, you were obligated in benching. You didn't do that, so when you come back, you bench. And after you bench, you have to wash again, say hamotzi for your Shabbos meal. The Rosh brings the Rif that agrees ultimately with Rav Sheshet. So both the Rif and the Rambam from more the Sephardic poskim, paskin lechumra like Rav Sheshet. Don't go to Ma'ariv in the middle of your meal. Make sure you have a later Ma'ariv minyan, because if you leave your house, that ends the Pores Mapal Mekadesh. You will have to ultimately bench and have two meals, one for Purim, one for Shabbos. and that will create another problem. And that, of course, is the problem of having a meal too close to Shabbos. If it's a Pares Mapa'u Mekadesh, one long meal, then of course it's okay. But if you're going to have two meals, then only the Ramah allows it on a Friday because that's the time when you're supposed to have the meal. But many poskim say, not good. Either have the meal in the morning or have the meal before the 10th hour. And therefore, according to the Rambam and the Rosh, it's not a good idea to go to Ma'ariv in the middle of the meal. But the Tosfot from the Ashkenazi world says the halacha is like Rav Chisda. That is, since you anyway have to go back to that place to bench, you ultimately can go to Ma'ariv, come home and continue the meal, and going to shul in the middle does not make a difference. Quoting his words, and I quote, if you are dealing with pat uminei mezonot, either bread or any other grain-based meal, ultimately, you don't have a problem of leaving the place. The Rosh agrees with the Rashbam that paskins this way, and the Mordechai, the Chavrusa of the Rosh, agrees as well. The Chen Halachai says, indeed, bread makes you go back to your original place to bench. Because of this, if indeed you changed your place, you do not have to remake brachot because it's one long meal. Lehalacha, not surprising, the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah disagree on this point. The Shulchan Aruch, of course, paskins like the Rambam and the Rif, because the Shulchan Aruch of Yosef Karo has a shita when it comes to Psak Halacha, and that is that anytime, I repeat, anytime he paskins halacha, he will paskin like the big three, the Rif, the Rosh, and the Rambam. And if they don't agree, like on this case, he'll do 2 out of 3. So since 2 out of 3, the Rif and the Rambam paskin l'chumra, the Shulchan Aruch paskins l'chumra, and I quote his words, you were eating in one particular home, and ultimately you went to another home. Says the Shulchan Aruch, and I quote his words, or because you changed your place, first you have to bench on the Purim meal, and then you wash, make a motzi, and make the meal for Shabbos. Once again, that is very problematic because ultimately that will turn out that you started a meal very late in the day on Friday without the Pores Mapa Umekadesh idea. But the Ramah, paskening like the Ashkenazic poskim, the Tosfot, the Rashbam, and the Mordechai, indeed paskins lekula, and he says sheshinui makom eino elaka sechadat. When it comes to bread-based meal, for sure, and maybe in general, the Ramah says it's not a problem. If you leave, you come back, it's still the same meal. You left your dining room, you went to shul. You don't have to go ahead and say hamotzi again, because ultimately it's one long meal. That's what the Ramah says. And indeed, the Mishnah Bura paskins like the Mara, Shichranu Ladina. The after lechatchila b'vadayna cholin ho kaharama shelo latzeit dvar reshut. We'll get to that later. Mikol makom kesheyotze enu levarech im yetziato hu aminat lachzor. If you go to shul in the middle of your Purim Seudah to daven Kabbalah, Shabbos, and Ma'ariv, and you know you want to come back to this meal, techashiv ka'omed be'emtza seudato. It's like you're in the middle of the meal, and therefore there is no problem of going. As a matter of fact, the Mishnah Bura adds, it might be a bracha she'ina tzricha. It might be a bracha you don't have to make because you're still in the middle of the meal. If you're actually paskin, like the Shulchan Aruch, maybe it's a bracha you don't have to make because ultimately you're going to bench, and a second later you're going to wash. That seems like a bracha you don't have to make. You usually make a bracha when you want to eat the next meal. But here, you're literally doing it within 2 minutes. So to make a long story short, if you indeed do not have a later Ma'ariv minyan after the Pores Mapal Mekadesh protocol, then according to the Shulchan Aruch, you would have to bench, go to shul, come back, make kiddush, wash, hamotzi, and that would put into question why did you start the meal so late in the day. But according to the Ramah, ultimately it's not a problem. In the middle of your meal, you can leave, daven Kabbalah, Shabbos, and Ma'ariv, and come back to the same meal. However, there are a few caveats to this machlokas, and it's not so simple. So even if you're an Ashkenazi and you say, oh, the Rama says it's okay, there are a few caveats. Caveat number one, and this actually helps us, that is that even though it's a machlokes between the Shulchan Aruch and the Rama, there is one little thing in the Masechet Psachim that helps us. Says the Gemara there, Meitivei, if there's a bunch of people that were eating together, and they went out because there's a groom or bride, meaning part of the people left the meal. When they leave, if you left the meal, but not everyone left, there was someone left behind, says the Gemara, you don't have to make another bracha. But if no one was left behind, everyone went to shul, in our case, then you do need to bench, wash, say amotzi. So we have a very good solution, because on this issue, the Shulchan Aruch actually paskins that this is true, even though he says l'chumra, if you don't leave people behind, in this case, say you're at a Purim Seudah, and part of the people went to shul, but there's a few people that didn't. Says the Shulchan Aruch, if even one person is left behind, says the Mishnah Berurah, in the words of the Shulchan Aruch, so ultimately we have a good solution. Even though it's a machlokes between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, even a Sephardi could leave in the middle, as long as part of the participants of your Seudat Purim, and ultimately your Shabbos meal, are left behind. But if everyone, I repeat, if everyone went to shul, then it's the machlokes between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. And indeed, the Ramah paskins this way as well, not surprisingly, because anyway he paskins that you don't have to make a bracha if you went to shul in the middle, but that would be a good solution. So ultimately, if you're having a late Purim Seudah, Pareis Mapal Mekadesh, you want to not go into this machlokes, there's a solution. What's the solution? Part of the people should go to shul and part can stay behind. If you left people behind, it's like you're in the middle of the Seudah because you're planning to go back to those very people. And therefore, that would be a good solution for the Pareis Mapal Mekadesh if you're going to shul in the middle. Namely, you can ultimately go ahead, go to shul and come back and not make a bracha, even according to the Shulchan Aruch, if you left people behind. However, this is not so simple. And there are a few caveats that I think make this very problematic. And therefore, I have advised, and I continue to advise, that if you're going to do a Pareis Mapal Mekadesh, you should try to make a Ma'ariv minyan after your meal. And the reason I said that is for the next three reasons. Number one, says the Ramah, the Ramah who was the big Mekel, if you diverted your attention from the meal, when you come back to the meal, vadai tzarich levarech al ma sherotze le'echol achar kach. Ve'en chiluk ben chazal ha'makom she'achal kvar u'ben siyem sudato b'makom acher. Says the Ramah, if you diverted your attention, all bets are off. You have to indeed first bench, then go to shul, then come home, wash, make kiddush first, say amotzi. In a word, if you're going to shul in the middle, you are definitely diverting your attention. First of all, you have to have your attention on Kabbalah, Shabbos, and Ma'ariv, on davening. Second of all, if your kavanah in davening is not so good, then you're probably going to see people there. A good Shabbos, how was your Purim Seudah? And I'm assuming that even though this is not right, you should not and you cannot, and it's usher to daven when you're tipsy. I'm assuming that maybe you'll see some people that were tipsy, and again, it would divert your attention from the meal. In other words, leaving in the middle of the meal to daven is a diversion of attention. And therefore, says the Ramah, that would be a problem. So problem number one is that in all probability, if you are going to go to shul in the middle of Pareis Mapal Mekadesh, you will ultimately divert your attention, and even Mr. Mekel, the Ramah, says that would be a problem, and you'd have to first bench. That puts off the Pareis Mapal Mekadesh idea because you diverted your attention. Reason number two why I don't advise davening in the middle of the meal is davening can take a while. Kabbalah Shabbos and Ma'ariv is not a short thing. It can take at least a half an hour, says the Mishnah Berurah. In general, the Mishnah Berurah was makel. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, caveat, rak im hu mishaer she'efshar she'aflig harbei, nachon yoter she'yivarech birkat hamazon k'sheyotzeh. But if you think you're going to go for a long time, then you should bench first. Now, shul on a Friday night is not short. Even if you daven Kabbalah Shabbos at home, you don't need a minyan for that. And you're only going to shul for Ma'ariv. You don't know exactly when Ma'ariv is going to be. It's not a 10-minute thing. You have to walk to shul. You have to get there. You're probably not going to get there exactly at Baruch Hu, so you have to wait. Then there's Baruch Hu. Then there's a good Shabbos, and then people are going to come up to you. It's a pretty long chunk of time. And according to the Mishnah Berurah, then you have to bench first. So the Poreis Mapal Nekadesh would be off the table because you're going for a long time. So problem number one is hasachat hada'at, diverting attention. And problem number two is even if your attention is on the meal you're going back to, still timing. The very fact that there's a good chunk of time you won't be home, not just a 5-minute I go see my neighbor, but a good half an hour, that would make a problem for your Poreis Mapal Mekadesh. Maybe you'd have to bench first. And problem number three is washing. Now we wash our hands simply because our hands touch things that make it impossible to eat bread without washing. Now, if you're at the meal, then you're careful. But ultimately, says the Shulchan Aruch in a different Simon Kuf Ayin Seif Aleph, Diberim Chavero V'Hiflig, if you're in the middle of a meal, you're already washed, you said Amotzi, but you started talking to your friend and it takes a while, you have to wash again because you diverted your attention from your hands. You're going to shul Friday night. I promise you, you will shake hands with people, wishing them a good Shabbos. So according to this, you'd have to wash again. Says the Mishnah Berurah, and explains very beautifully, the kevan shehiflig sha'a achat o shtayim, because it took you a while, hisiach da'ato misudato, you diverted your attention from the meal, velonis hardly shmo yardav, and you didn't be careful that nothing should touch your hands when you went to shul. Ve'henaskaniot, and you use your hands. You're going to say good Shabbos to people, not because you're a bad person. That's what you usually do Friday night. It's natural. So he does bring the Birkei Yosef, the Chidah, that says you do not need to wash your hands again. But ultimately, the Mishnah Berurah himself, at least, is of the opinion that you do. So for these three reasons, number one, going to shul in and of itself is a hesech hadat. It diverts your attention from the meal. And even the Ramah says, if you divert your attention from the meal, it's a problem. Number two, you're gone for a long time. You're not just gone for 10 minutes. And number three, the problem of washing, you may have to wash again. My advice has been that you try to make a Ma'ariv minyan after the Poreis Mapal Mekadesh. So you started your meal on Purim, on Friday, you went into Shabbos, you benched, and then at 7 o'clock in the evening, or whenever it is, you make a Ma'ariv minyan with the people that did the same thing. Kabbalah Shabbos should be at the meal itself, when Shabbos comes in, but Ma'ariv should be later. For these three reasons, namely, one, you divert your attention, two, you're gone for a long time, and three, you may have to wash again, at least without a bracha. If, however, this is impossible, and there's no way to make a Ma'ariv minyan later in the evening, then my advice is, if you're going to do a Poreis Mapa Umekadesh, then you ultimately should try very hard not to forget you're going back to the meal. You should try to make your time in shul the least possible. Namely, don't stay around to say good Shabbos to everyone. And when you get home, you should at least wash again without a bracha. That's my advice if you have no choice. But again, I think that we have to, in this particular instance, try to make a later Ma'ariv minyan. This is not my chiddush, this is the words of the Ramah. Again, Mr. Ramah, who says in general, you can leave a meal in the middle if you need to, and don't have to wash and bench and make brachos again. The Ramah ultimately says, lechatchila lo yeyaker mimkomo belo bracha. In general, you should not leave a meal to go daven lechatchila. The chayshinan, because we're worried, everyone agrees you'll come back home. But once you're home, you may be full and you'll forget to eat the Shabbos meal. If you're at one meal and you daven Ma'ariv later, then you're constantly in the middle of the meal by definition. So you're eating, you're drinking, whatever it might be. But if you take a break, you go to shul, you come back, it could very well be you come back, you're full. You're not going to go back to eating. Once you get up from the table, you get up from the table. Meal, says the Ramah. Letzarech mitzvah uveret, kegon shehigia zman tefillah mutar. It is okay, says the Ramah, if there's only one minyan. And that's the minyan that you need to go to leave your meal in the middle. And I just said the protocol of what to do. But ultimately, says the Ramah, it's better not to. So therefore, to sum up, it's better if you do a Pores Mapal Mekadesh to have a later Ma'ariv minyan after you've benched and you finished your meal. If it's impossible, it's a machloket Shulchan Aruch in the Ramah, and therefore, I think you could be making like the Ramah, especially if you're Ashkenazi, and not have to wash and bench again. However, this is only if A, the time you're gone is very short, B, you did not divert your attention from the meal, and C, you were careful with your hands. If all those things didn't happen, it calls into question if you are allowed to continue the meal when you get home from shul without making brachos. And therefore, you have to be very careful if you go out in the middle of the meal to not divert your attention, to watch your hands, that it should not touch things that it shouldn't. And finally, most importantly, to try to limit the time that you're not home. So once again, better to have a later Ma'ariv minyan, but if it's impossible, there is a way. I repeat, there is a way to go to Ma'ariv in the middle, and we mentioned the protocol that you should keep. Wishing everyone a wonderful day.